She had a melodious name, Esmeralda. She also had a white goat named Jolly with golden horns and hooves. This little goat could perform tricks and mimic the comical gestures of aristocrats. Esmeralda and her goat arrived in Paris with a band of wanderers. She danced, sang, and directed her goat to perform tricks in the square to earn a living, bringing endless joy to the people of Paris in exchange for the copper and silver coins they threw to her. Thus, the priest, the bellringer, the down-and-out poet, and the wandering bohemian girl Esmeralda, seemingly unrelated individuals, became intertwined in a legendary tale due to a dramatic encounter. How did this fateful meeting come about? Let's return to January 6, 1482, to find out. What day was it? Since ancient times, it had been a day to celebrate Epiphany and the Feast of Fools. In the Palace of Justice in Paris, a mystery play was being performed, written by our down-and-out poet, Pierre Gringoire. Unfortunately, no one paid much attention to his work. This unlucky poet, unable to earn his fee, had no money for food or lodging and wandered the streets. On that day, as he wandered into the place to grieve, like everyone else, he was instantly captivated by Esmeralda dancing at the center of the crowd. Among the spectators was another notable figure, the Archdeacon of Notre Dame, Father Claude. Esmeralda's impact on the priest was profound, almost philosophical. He stared at her intently, his eyes filled with a magical light. Then, the procession of the King of Fools arrived at the square, including ragged vagabonds, thieves, and disabled people, along with acrobats. The newly elected King of Fools was none other than Quasimodo. He held a scepter, wore a robe, and had a crown on his head, proudly seated at the center of the procession. It was his first time feeling a sense of self-respect and joy. He was completely immersed in happiness, dominated by pride, and his melancholic, unfortunate face glowed with radiant light. However, just as Quasimodo was reveling in his bliss, his adoptive father, Father Claude, stormed in and stopped the procession, angrily snatching the gilded scepter that symbolized the King of Fools. There was a gasp of horror as people saw the fearsome Quasimodo leap from his seat. The original text says, "Women turned away, not wanting to see him tear the archdeacon to pieces." But instead of the scene, Quasimodo knelt down to the archdeacon and allowed him to pull off his crown, break his scepter, and tear that glittering priest frock. Yes, there were only two things that the ferocious Quasimodo revered greatly. First, Notre Dame, and second, his adopted father. Due to his deafness, Quasimodo could only communicate with Claude through gestures. They used a secret sign language that no one else understood. After some gesturing, the two of them walked away into a narrow alley, and the crowd dispersed. At this point, Esmeralda had finished her performance and was heading back to her residence. Our down-and-out poet, under some strange spell, was inexplicably compelled to follow this beautiful girl. He trailed her through a maze of alleys, past the market and the gallows. Just as the girl turned a corner, the poet heard a sharp cry. He saw her being seized by two men, struggling in their arms. He didn't know who they were, but they were trying to silence her, preventing her from screaming. Her poor little goat was also terrified, bleeding with its head down. "Help! Night watch!" It was a cry for help from the down-and-out poet. He cried out as he bravely went forward to try to save the maiden. At this time, one of the two men who had seized the maiden turned his head, and the poet recognized at once that it was Quasimodo, with that terrible face. Quasimodo came toward him, backhanding the poet, sending him sprawling onto the stone road several feet away. Then Quasimodo quickly turned back into the darkness, lifting the girl as if she were a silk scarf draped over his arm. The poet watched helplessly as Quasimodo and his accomplice abducted Esmeralda. Can you guess who Quasimodo's accomplice was? Yes, none other than Archdeacon Claude. Quasimodo would only obey his adoptive father. This time, he had come to abduct the girl under his father's orders. However, the plan didn't succeed because the poet's cry for help was heard by Captain Phoebus, the captain of the archers of the king's Praetorian Guard. He arrived just in time to save Esmeralda and capture Quasimodo. Claude, amidst the chaos and darkness, quietly slipped away. The story doesn't end here. Our unfortunate poet woke up from unconsciousness to find everyone gone. He continued walking and was soon beset by 3 beggars. Confused and disoriented, he stumbled into the sanctuary area. What kind of place was this? Extremely dangerous. Let's see how the novel describes it. The sanctuary area was the thieves' domain, a hideous tumor on Paris's face. It was a gutter where the waters ran every morning, sending back the vagrants, beggars, and malodorous wanderers who roamed the capital streets by night. It was a vast hive of villainy where the drones brought their plunder every day. Like a deceitful infirmary, it harbored all sorts of corruption and filth. Here, bohemians, defrocked monks, disillusioned scholars, people of different nationalities and religions mingled together, their bodies covered in painted sores. Beggars by day and thieves by night, this was a grand dressing room where all the robberies, prostitution, and assassinations of the streets of Paris were orchestrated and executed. Our unfortunate poet found himself surrounded by these denizens of the dark, who then dragged him to their leader. This leader, the same man who had been at the head of the procession of thieves during the Fool's Day parade, intended to have the poet hanged. The poet, naturally unwilling to accept such a fate, entered into negotiations, and only one chance for survival remained. According to Bohemian law, if a woman stood up and declared her willingness to marry a condemned man, he would be spared. So, the poet looked around desperately. 3 women stepped forward from the crowd, including beggars and ugly old hags, but after a few questions, they all rejected him. Just as the poet was about to despair, a young girl stepped forward and boldly declared, "I want him." This girl was none other than Esmeralda. This beautiful rose had spoken the words, "I want him." The leader of the sanctuary area brought forth a jug and instructed the poet to smash it on the ground. The jug shattered into 4 pieces. The leader placed his hands on the foreheads of the poet and Esmeralda and declared, "Brother, she is now your wife. Sister, he is now your husband. For 4 years, go now." The poet's life was spared, but was Esmeralda truly willing to marry this down-and-out poet? No, she had no desire to marry this unfortunate man. She only did so to repay him for his cry for help, which she perceived as a small act of saving her. Although the poet's call for help had been of little practical assistance, Esmeralda still felt indebted to him. So, she stood up and declared her willingness to marry him, thereby repaying the debt. This marriage was, of course, in name only, but it revealed Esmeralda's character. She was compassionate and loyal, with a clear sense of gratitude and justice. Now let's turn back to Quasimodo. After being captured for kidnapping Esmeralda, he was taken to the scaffold at the Place de Grève to be flogged. What was the scene of the punishment like? The rotating wheel suddenly brought Quasimodo's towering hunchback in front of the executioner, who then raised his arm, swinging the finely crafted whip in the air, producing a hissing sound like a water snake. The sound of the whip cutting through the air indicated its immense force.